The horror genre as a whole is pretty controversial. Whilst it does sit its 6th most popular genre in movie theatres with a total box office over $10 billion from just 519 films in the past 23 years, the majority of horror films, at least, are absolutely slated by reviewers across the board. These days, the average rating for a horror movie sits at about 50% on sites like IMDb and Rotten Tomatoes. This is a genre entrenched in cheap scare tactics, gratuitous gore and violence, and rarely any deeper message to convey. That's why 2004's Thai horror feature film Shutter, directed by Banjong Pisanthanakul, garnered attention from across the globe, and was one of the director's first feature films. He later went on to direct Alone in 2007, based on Agatha Christie's book Elephants Can Remember, and a segment for the very popular anthology horror comedy The ABCs of Death. But what makes the film so great? Of course, it's a complex question, and really comes down to a huge number of variables working in the film's favour. The plot follows a couple that deal with the guilt of a hit and run, as it quite literally haunts and weighs on them, and the scares are very well placed, well built up, and the movie leaves much more to the imagination than the amount it shows on screen, which in my opinion is a good thing. Our own psyches can dream up horrors far scarier than any special effects or makeup could produce. Underlying all of these aspects, however, is the sound design for this film. And in this video essay, I hope to analyse all the main techniques employed by Banjong and his sound editor Fromel Bencharankit, and really get down to what makes this film so effective in leaving a lasting impact on its audience. There are certain techniques that the director and sound guys have purposefully mixed for in this movie, and one of the most recurring and classic of this film genre is the horror leitmotif. This is basically a sound cue that tells our audience when something evil is afoot, even if we have no prior visual connection or relation to something paranormal. This film loves using this technique, and it builds up the viewer's correlation between the sound and the paranormal from the very start. Here we see our protagonist Tun as he spots the ghost of the woman he's hit and run for the first time. Notice how the ambient sound chimes in just as he spots her. With this ingrained in the audience's head, we no longer even need to see the ghost to know that it's there somewhere watching the characters when we hear the sound. This is literally displayed 3 minutes after we first hear the sound. All we see is some rather innocuous photographs, but we instantly know, just from the sound, that we've already linked to the ghost, that there's some kind of evil, paranormal nature to the photographs. And this is repeated constantly through the entire movie, multiple times. Let's look at the first jump scare of the film. Jump scares are another hallmark of the horror genre, and it's easy to disregard the technique as just a cheap way to style an audience, but a lot of work does go into creating a soundscape, and of course video, that really gets the viewer's heart racing. This film is no different, but it raises a lot of interesting technical effects used by the sound editor, so let's look at it. In the scene, Tun's girlfriend Jane comes home to an empty house, and sees some kind of shadowy movement from inside Tun's darkroom. Right from the start, we can hear how the Atmos tracks have been slowly raised to match how Jane leans into the door. This is a good starting point to convey how sound is used to put us more into the scene, since we really do feel right there next to her as she moves towards the big bad, but more on that technique later. So then we're hit with the jump scare, and what this film employs very successfully is making the diegetic sound into a startling, frightening experience, as we actually hear the loud rattling of this doorknob as something inside tries to get out. This is a lot more natural than forcing in non-diegetics to evoke a reaction, with the usual orchestral violin squeaks and the like. We get this again in one of the final scares of the film, where Tun's being chased down a building's ladder by the ghost. We're right in the midst of a huge storm, and we hear the crash of lightning as we're shown her face in all of its grisly glory. Just more diegetic sound used to make us really feel that we're there rather than just watching a movie. But back to the first jump scare. When the door stops rattling, we're hit with total silence for just a second, before even the most innocuous and average sounds start becoming the loudest. The editors and sound producers did this intentionally, to produce the effect that our ears have adjusted to the sound of silence, like how an iris adjusts to the new levels of light. And why else but of course to set us up for more scares. This moves back to the point of how sound is used to put us into the scene. Look how it's used here. Did you notice that? We're actually told seconds before we see anything on screen that there's something there, something lurking inside the sink. The sound editor has EQ'd the high frequencies way down to give us the effect of being underwater. It gives us a perspective that tells us far before it shows us. And as far as perspective goes, it's a big thing in this film. A lot of thought was put into the sound design for where the audience should be.
อะไรนะเฮ้ยมึงชัวร์นะว่ามึงเช็คหมดทุกที่ละ
Notice how even with the camera outside the car, the audio mimics how it would sound if we were sitting right there next to them. This gives the DOP and director the freedom to show whatever they please on screen, because the sound production has let them move the camera to whatever distance whilst keeping the audience connected and intimate with our protagonists. You get another example of this when Ton and Jane sit in their front room.
Gong เป็นอะไรเหรอ
ไม่รู้เหมือนกันนะรูปเสียเต็มเลย
Notice how hilariously far we're seeing them from, all the while we hear every minute sound in incredible detail, like the mics have been put right up in front of them, like we're sitting there with them as they speak in hushed voices. Again, it's just a technique used to really put us into the film world to make us feel like we're right there experiencing what they've been. The second big jump scare of the film tells us a lot about the way that the film was mixed in order to evoke feelings of fear. You can hear how the Atmos and ambient tracks are slowly pushed up, starting about 5 seconds before the actual jump scare hits. Attentive viewers are made to know that this jump scare is coming, even before it arrives, building an incredibly tense atmosphere that could have easily just been a cheap shock out of nowhere. The mix is used to help us decide what to feel in other ways too, like the ending suicide of our protagonist. And, for that matter, the first car crash that began the entire film's plot. As we reach a climactic peak in sound and action, the aftermath is almost total silence with sparse visual content to match. We're left completely alone as an audience in these moments, left to wonder what has just become of the characters we've just seen affected. These are almost periods of time as an audience that we're given to think, breathers between the action. Sound is also used to transport us elsewhere in the film, sometimes even without visual cues that without sound would render the effect to be totally lost on us. In this scene, the ghost's corpse is being cremated, and whilst we have no visual cues that would tell us that Ton has begun to hallucinate, the audio is a totally different story. The chanting of the monks begin to reverberate around us dreamily, which tells the audience that we're seeing things introspectively, as if we are Ton disassociating from the world around him to visit elsewhere in his own mind.
รู้จักเขาตอนสมัยเรียนเขาชื่อเนต
Again here, we're transported by the audio to a totally foreign time and place. In the midst of a huge rainstorm, our Atmos pans down entirely and gives way to this new ambience, and a diegetic voiceover. Watching this clip muted, we as an audience could easily misinterpret this to just be a random cutaway to the next day, but it's the sound work that gives all of this contextual understanding. In a lot of ways, Shudder is your average movie. The plot is pretty obvious, and the tropes aren't really subverted, and the characters are more vessels to transport us through the scares than characters we relate to and feel bad for. But if the film is one thing, it's incredibly scary. And for the film to evoke emotion in the way that this one does, what matters is the immersion, what we're shown, and more importantly, what we're not shown at all. It's truly the sound design that pulls together every scare, every flashback sequence, and every moment we spend with the characters together. And that's why Shudder is such a horrifying, impact-leaving film that'll make you afraid to look in your bathroom mirror once you've watched it.